Good day! Welcome to K-Linguistics. Today we will talk about the communication process, how communication works. Let us first define communication. It is the act of developing meaning among entities or groups through the use of sufficiently mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic conventions. Meanwhile, the communication process refers to a series of actions or steps taken in order to successfully communicate. This process is extremely vital in increasing your effectiveness in communicating. Now, this diagram shows the communication process. It involves several components such as the sender of the communication, the actual message being sent, the encoding of the message, the receiver, and the decoding of the message. If you have an understanding of the different stages and components of this process, it will help you increase the extent to which you communicate effectively. Now, the communication process starts with the sender. The sender is the person who transmits a particular message. This is called encoding. And encoding is not only determining what it is you're going to say, but how you're going to communicate it. This includes non-verbal communication, things like body language and the tone of our voice, the pace of our voice, whether or not we make eye contact, and all factors on how we send a particular message. The goal here for the sender is to communicate something as accurately as possible. And what that means is you have to take into account the knowledge and the education and the background of the receiver of that message. Because if you communicate in a way that cannot be understood, then you really are just wasting your time. It's not very effective. Remember, the intent is to be understood. Now we have here at the center of the communication process the message which is to be encoded. That message gets sent to the receiver. Depending upon which medium we chose to communicate with, that will transmit a number of different ways. The receiver is the listener, reader, or observer to whom a message is directed. The receiver is also called the audience or decoder. They are in charge of decoding that message. And when we say decoding, it means they're trying to understand it, they're interpreting that particular message, and so they're listening to what is being said, and they're trying to assess what that is and gauge it for understanding. Now, a problem that you've probably picked up on is that a lot of times people can hear the same message and take two completely different things. And that's because there's a lot of noise that gets involved in the communication process. A noise is a barrier to communication. Not only do you have to be aware of the understanding of the receiver, but you also have to take into account physical noise like surroundings. Are there people involved? If you're communicating in a noisy restaurant, there's a physical limitation. The actual noise in the restaurant is going to affect the receiver's understanding of your message. You also have to consider the person's mental state. Are they preoccupied? You can probably think of the time when you were involved in a conversation and you're communicating with somebody, but your mind is somewhere else. And although you are physically present, you are mentally absent. And that obviously is a barrier to communication. Another thing you should consider is the receiver's education or level of development. If you're communicating with someone who is of higher or lesser educational level, you have to take that into account. For example, communicating with a group of elementary students is different than communicating with a group of professionals. Now, these three are just some of the barriers or noise in communication. Moving on, we have feedback. This refers to the response or reaction of receiver to the sender's message. Feedback comes in two forms, namely verbal and non-verbal communication. When we say verbal, it's the things you're actually saying using words. Meanwhile, non-verbal communication involves body language, posture, eye contact, and those types of things. So that's communication process for you. As a recap, we discussed about communication and its process. The communication process involves two parties, the sender and the receiver. sender encodes the message, providing meaning to it. Then the receiver decodes it, trying to understand that particular message. We also have the noise, the barrier to communication, and finally, the feedback, which shows whether or not the receiver understands the message. And that is how the communication process works. That's all for today's episode. This is K Linguistics. Have a nice day.